300 warriors did not ride into Dust Valley for no reason. They came for blood, for justice, or maybe for war. The cowboy standing alone in the town square, his shadow long in the morning light, was about to learn which. To understand how it all unfolded, you have to go back, just 24 hours earlier. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps keep stories like this alive. Dust Valley was a hardscrabble town, a handful of weathered shacks clinging to life in the desert's grip. The sun baked the earth until it cracked, and the wind carried dust that stung like needles. The only law was the kind you carried in a holster. The saloon was the town's beating heart, a grimy den where men shouted over whiskey, their voices rough, their laughter sharp. Oil lamps flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. She stumbled through the saloon door, rain-soaked and shivering. A young woman, maybe 19, her face pale as bone. Her dress was torn, clinging to her thin frame. Mud caked on her boots. Dark hair stuck to her cheeks, and her eyes darted, wild and haunted, like she'd seen something she couldn't shake. She didn't belong in this pit of drunks and drifters. The room hushed for a heartbeat. Then the laughter roared back, cruel and loud, like they were mocking her for daring to exist. A man rose from the bar, his bulk blocking the lamplight. Clyde, a brute with a mean streak and a reputation for breaking anything weaker than him. His shirt was stained with sweat, his breath sour with cheap liquor. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin, bruising her pale arm. "Please, do not touch me," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the din. Clyde's grin was ugly, his yellow teeth bared as he yanked her closer. The crowd hooted, pounding tables, turning her fear into their entertainment. The saloon door groaned on its hinges, but nobody noticed. All eyes were on Clyde and the girl. She twisted, her boots slipping on the wet floor, her free hand clawing at his grip. "Let me go," she said, louder now, her voice trembling but sharp. The men laughed harder, some tossing coins, betting on how long she'd fight. Nobody saw the shadow shift in the corner, the faint scrape of a chair against the floorboards. A man stood, tall and lean, his face half hidden under a battered hat. The cowboy. Nobody knew his name, not really. He'd drifted into town a few days back, keeping to himself, nursing a drink in the saloon's darkest corner. Now he stepped into the lamplight, his shadow stretching long and sharp across the wall. His gloved hand rested on his revolver, and his eyes locked on Clyde. Cold and unyielding, like a wolf sizing up its prey. The room went dead quiet. Rain pattered on the roof, a glass clinked as someone forgot to set it down. "Buong te," the cowboy said, his voice low, like the rumble before a storm. Just 2 words, but they hit like a fist. Clyde's grin faltered, his hand still tight on the girl. Her eyes flicked to the cowboy, wide with fear and a spark of hope. Clyde forced a laugh, but it was thin, brittle. "You think you are some hero?" he said, yanking a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed as he raised it toward the girl's torn dress, the tip grazing her collar. She gasped, jerking back, but his grip was iron. The crowd leaned in, their faces hungry for blood or shame or whatever came next. A flash lit the room, followed by a crack like thunder splitting the sky. The cowboy's gun smoked in his hand. Clyde's knife clattered to the floor, blood dripping from his arm, staining the wood red. He stumbled back, clutching the wound, his face twisted in pain and shock. The saloon was silent, the echo of the shot ringing in their ears. Every man frozen, every breath held. An old man at the bar broke the quiet, his voice trembling. "That is Red Hawk's daughter, the princess of the 300 warriors." Heads turned, eyes widened. The girl's face drained of what little color it had. She looked at the cowboy, then down at the floor, like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. The bartender, a wiry man with a limp and a face carved from years of hard living, shuffled forward, his hands shaking as he poured a shot nobody wanted. "You have gone and done it now, stranger," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Red Hawk don't let nobody touch his kin," and walk away. The cowboy didn't answer, just holstered his gun and stepped over Clyde, who was cursing and cradling his arm. The girl backed away, her breath ragged, and slipped out into the rain, her shadow vanishing into the storm. In the back of the saloon, a piano player, his fingers still hovering over the keys, watched the scene unfold. He'd seen fights before, but this was different. The cowboy's calm, the girl's fear. It stirred something in him, a memory of a sister he'd lost to men like Clyde. He pushed the piano stool back, stood, and slipped out the side door, determined to warn someone, anyone, before the town paid the price. Word spread through Dust Valley like wildfire in dry grass. The cowboy had saved her, but he'd also kicked a hornet's nest. Red Hawk's tribe was legend, 300 warriors strong, each one a killer who'd rather die than let an insult stand. By morning, the town was alive with panic. "They are coming," folks whispered, bolting doors and windows, their voices tight with fear. 300. For her. In the livery stable, a handful of men gathered, their faces grim. "That drifter's brought death on us all," one said, spitting tobacco into the straw. His brother, a skinny man with nervous hands, nodded. "Should have let Clyde have his fun. Now we are all paying for it." Outside, the rain pounded, turning the streets to mud, as if the town was sinking under the weight of what was coming. The girl found the cowboy at the edge of town, saddling his horse under a sagging awning. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice small but steady, her wet hair clinging to her face. "They will burn this place to ash because of me." He didn't look at her, just tugged the saddle strap tight. "Did what I had to," he said, his tone flat, but his eyes carried a shadow, like he was seeing something far beyond the storm. In the general store, Clara, a woman with graying hair and a spine of steel, clutched a sack of flour, her knuckles white. She'd seen the girl stumble into the saloon, seen the fear in her eyes, and it stirred a memory of her own daughter, lost to the desert years ago. "He did right," she muttered to the shopkeeper, who just shook his head. "Right or wrong, Clara, he's dragged us all into hell." She slammed the flour down, her jaw tight, and stepped out to watch the cowboy from the porch, her eyes fierce with something like pride. A stable hand, barely 20, leaned against a post, his hands trembling as he rolled a cigarette he didn't light. He'd been in the saloon, seen the cowboy's shot, seen the girl's face. He didn't flinch, he said to nobody, his voice low. "Man like that don't come around often." He tossed the cigarette into the mud, grabbed a pitchfork, and headed toward the square, ready to stand with the stranger if it came to it. Folks in town were not grateful. They called him reckless, a fool who'd doomed them all. Some packed bags, ready to flee before dawn. Others hid behind shutters, cursing his name. He didn't seem to notice. He checked his gun, reloaded it slow and deliberate, then took up a spot in the town square, standing like a lone tree in a storm, his coat soaked through. A kid, barely 12, sprinted through the mud, his bare feet slapping the ground. He'd been checking rabbit traps when he saw them shadows moving in the hills, too many to count. He burst into the blacksmith's shop, gasping. "They are close," he shouted. The blacksmith, a bear of a man with hands black from soot, dropped his hammer and grabbed a rifle. "How many?" he asked, his voice low. The boy's eyes were wild. "All of them," he said. "Hundreds." In a small church at the town's edge, a preacher stood at his pulpit, his hands clasped tight. He'd heard the whispers of Red Hawk's coming, seen the fear in his flock's eyes. "The Lord tests us," he said to the empty pews, his voice shaking but firm. "But sometimes, salvation comes in a stranger's form." He stepped outside, his boots sinking in the mud, and headed toward the square, his Bible tucked under his arm, ready to face whatever came. Dawn broke, and the earth shook. Hooves thundered, kicking up red dust that choked the air like a storm. 300 warriors, their war paint black and red, rode into Dust Valley, their spears glinting in the first light. The town froze. Women screamed, pulling kids inside. Doors slammed, locks clicked. The square was empty, except for one man. The cowboy stood alone, his coat flapping in the wind, his hand on his gun. Red Hawk rode forward, a giant on horseback, his face carved from stone. "Who dares touch my blood?" he roared, his voice rattling the windows. The warriors behind him raised their spears, ready to turn the town into a graveyard. A woman in the crowd, her face lined by years of desert sun, clutched her shawl and whispered to her husband. That's the chief's daughter, all right. But why's she standing up for him? Her husband, a farmer with a bad limp, shook his head. Don't matter. Blood's been spilled. Red Hawk won't let it go. The woman's fingers tightened on her shawl, her eyes fixed on the girl, like she saw her own youth in that desperate stand. Then the girl ran out, her torn clothes flapping, throwing herself between the cowboy and her father. It was not him, she cried, her voice breaking like glass. He saved me, the warriors murmured, confused. The townsfolk, peering from their windows, didn't know what to make of it. Red Hawk's eyes narrowed, his hand still gripping his spear. In a nearby alley, a saloon girl named Lily, who'd seen the whole thing go down the night before, gripped the arm of her friend. That cowboy didn't have to step in, she said, her voice low, her eyes shining with something like awe. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Her friend, a cook with calloused hands, nodded slowly. He's either brave or crazy, maybe both. Lily's gaze lingered on the cowboy, her heart racing as she watched the girl plead. A shopkeeper's wife, peering through a crack in her shutters, clutched a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. She'd seen the girl's fear, seen the cowboy's courage, and it stirred something in her, a faith she'd thought was long gone. He's standing for her, she whispered to her husband, who was loading a shotgun. Maybe he's standing for us all. Her husband grunted, but his hand slowed, his eyes flicking to the square with new respect. Red Hawk wasn't swayed. Saved or not, his hand touched you, he said, his voice like a blade on stone. Blood washes blood. The cowboy tipped his hat back, slow, revealing a jagged scar across his forehead. Red Hawk's face flickered, just for a moment. Recognition. Something old, buried deep. A young warrior, his face painted with fresh grief, pushed through the ranks, his spear shaking in his hands. That's the man, he said, his voice low but fierce, pointing at the cowboy. The one who left my brother to die in the canyon fight. The other warriors stirred, their murmurs growing sharp. The girl's face twisted, her hands balling into fists as she looked at the cowboy, waiting for him to speak, to explain. A grizzled prospector, watching from a boarded-up shop, muttered to himself, his hands clutching a rusted pickaxe. Knew that cowboy looked familiar, he said, his voice rough from years of dust and whiskey. Heard tales of a man who rode with Red Hawk's tribe, then vanished. Never thought I'd see him here. He squinted, his eyes tracing the scar on the cowboy's forehead, piecing together a story nobody else knew. You, Red Hawk growled, leaning forward on his horse. The traitor who broke our pact. The townsfolk didn't understand, their faces blank. The girl looked between them, her eyes wide. Father, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The cowboy didn't move. His eyes stayed on the ground, letting the accusation sit. Finally he spoke, his voice rough as rawhide. I fought beside you, Red Hawk, years ago, but I walked away. He looked up, meeting the chief's gaze. Did not know she was yours. The girl's mouth fell open, her breath catching. The warriors shifted, their spears still up but wavering now. High on a rooftop, a sharpshooter crouched, his rifle trained on the cowboy. He was a hired gun, paid by the saloon owner, who didn't like strangers stirring trouble. The cowboy was a dead man, he figured, so why not cash in? His finger brushed the trigger, but a crow landed on the barrel, flapping its wings. He swore, swatting at it, and the shot went wide, pinging off a weather vane. Nobody below noticed, but the air felt colder, like fate had just blinked. A blacksmith's wife, watching from her doorway, clutched her apron, her hands trembling. She'd heard stories of Red Hawk's wars, seen the scars on her husband from battles long past. The cowboy's scar, that jagged line, brought it all back. He's no stranger to pain, she whispered to her daughter, who stood wide-eyed beside her. But he's standing there anyway. Her daughter nodded, her small hands clenched, inspired by a courage she didn't yet understand. Red Hawk's face twisted with old rage. You left us to die, he said, and now you stand here, playing savior? The girl grabbed her father's arm, her voice desperate. He did not hurt me. He stopped the man who did. Red Hawk raised his hand, and 300 spears lifted, ready to end it all. A boy, no older than 9, peeked out from behind a water trough, his hands clutching a slingshot. He'd been in the saloon last night, hiding under a table, watching the cowboy save the girl. Now, with the warriors ready to strike, he couldn't just watch. He loaded a stone, his hands shaking, and aimed at a warrior's spear, hoping to knock it loose. The stone flew wide, but it clattered against a shield, making the warrior flinch. The boy ducked back, heart pounding, as eyes turned his way. She didn't wait. The girl threw herself in front of the cowboy, arms spread wide. "If you kill him, you kill me too," she said, tears streaming down her face. The warriors froze. The townsfolk gasped from their hiding spots. The cowboy's hand trembled on his gun, just a fraction. His face still, but his eyes betraying a crack of emotion. Red Hawk stared at his daughter, his eyes wet, his fist clenched. Fury and love fought in his face, tearing him apart. The square was silent, her words pressing down like a storm cloud. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The whole world seemed to hang on his next word. An old woman, the town's healer, hobbled forward, her cane digging into the dirt. She'd buried too many, seen too much blood in her years. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice sharp as a whip. She pointed at Red Hawk, then the cowboy. "You two are cut from the same cloth, stubborn, haunted, carrying ghosts you can't outrun." Her words hit hard, and Red Hawk's shoulders sagged, just for a moment, like he felt the truth in them. A widow, standing at the edge of the crowd, clutched a locket with her late husband's picture. She'd lost him to a raid years ago, one Red Hawk's tribe had been blamed for. Now, watching the girl stand up to her father, she felt a pang of hope she hadn't known in years. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Let her choose," she said, looking at Red Hawk. "She's earned that much." The chief's eyes flicked to her, surprised, but he didn't speak. A young mother, her baby cradled in her arms, stood frozen near a well. She'd been too scared to leave her home, but the girl's cry pulled her out. She remembered her own father, a man who'd never listened, and saw the same fire in the girl's eyes. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "She's your daughter, not your property," she said to Red Hawk. The warriors shifted, some lowering their spears, caught off guard by her courage. Then chaos broke loose. Clyde, the thug from the saloon, burst from the crowd, a stolen pistol in his hand. His arm was bandaged, his face a mask of hate. He fired wild, bullets ripping through the air. The girl screamed. The warriors raised their spears, ready to charge. The saloon caught fire, flames leaping up the walls, smoke choking the square. A teenage girl, hiding behind a barrel, gripped a kitchen knife she'd grabbed from her mother's shop. She'd seen Clyde hurt her friend, seen the cowboy step in. Now, with the town burning, she couldn't stay hidden. She threw the knife, aiming for Clyde's leg. It grazed his thigh, and he stumbled, cursing. The warriors turned, their spears glinting, and Clyde's face paled as he realized he'd made a mistake. The cowboy moved like lightning. He grabbed the girl, pulling her behind him as bullets flew. His coat took a hit, the fabric tearing, but he didn't slow. He ran through the smoke, shielding her, his face smeared with ash, his eyes locked on her. The townsfolk scattered, some grabbing buckets to fight the fire, others running for their lives. A shopkeeper, a quiet man who'd never raised a fist, picked up a shovel and joined the townsfolk battling the flames. He'd always stayed out of trouble, but seeing the cowboy risk everything lit something in him. He swung the shovel, knocking burning debris away from a child trapped near the saloon. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but strong, as he pulled the kid to safety. In the chaos, a saloon regular, a drunk who'd laughed at the girl's pleas the night before, stood frozen, his bottle slipping from his hand. He'd cheered for Clyde, thought it was all a game. Now, watching the cowboy shield the girl, he felt a shame he couldn't name. He grabbed a bucket, splashing water on the flames, his hands shaking not from fear but from a need to make things right. The cowboy caught Clyde. One swift move, and the thug was on the ground, the pistol skidding across the dirt. He dragged Clyde to Red Hawk and threw him down. "This is the one you want," the cowboy said, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames. He touched her. "Not me. Spare the town." A young warrior broke from the ranks, his face painted with grief, his eyes burning. He knelt beside Clyde, his voice shaking. "This man stole my sister's honor last spring," he said, looking at Red Hawk. The chief's face hardened, and he nodded once. The warrior's spear flashed, and Clyde's scream died in his throat. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others staring, unable to look away. A mother in the crowd, her arms wrapped around her 2 children, sobbed quietly. She'd been in the saloon last night, serving drinks, too scared to speak when Clyde grabbed the girl. Now, watching the warrior's spear find its mark, she felt a weight lift, like justice had answered. She hugged her kids tighter, whispering, "It's over." As tears streaked her face, Red Hawk looked at Clyde's body, then at his daughter, then at the cowboy. The warriors waited, their spears still raised. The chief's jaw tightened. He raised his hand, and a single arrow flew. Clyde twitched, then went still, his blood pooling in the dirt. The warriors lowered their weapons, the air heavy with the weight of justice. The chief turned to the cowboy. "You have paid your debt," he said, his voice heavy but clear. With this, the warriors bowed their heads, a silent nod to the man who'd faced their wrath. The townsfolk crept out, staring at the cowboy like they were seeing a ghost come to life. The girl reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but warm against his calloused palm. But it wasn't over. A group of drifters, men who'd never trusted the cowboy, saw their chance. "He cannot be the hero," one hissed, pulling a gun. "He will turn this town upside down." They stepped into the square, weapons drawn, thinking the chaos would hide them. The girl saw them first and screamed, her voice piercing the smoke. A teenage boy, the blacksmith's apprentice, stood frozen near a water pump, his hands still wet from hauling buckets. He'd always looked up to men like Clyde, thought they were strong. Now, seeing the drifters aim at the cowboy, he realized what strength was. He grabbed a loose board from a broken crate and swung it, cracking one drifter's arm. The man howled, dropping his gun, and the boy stood tall, his chest heaving. A seamstress, her hands calloused from years of needlework, watched from her shop's doorway. She'd sewn clothes for half the town, heard their stories, their fears. The cowboy's stand, the girl's courage, it woke something in her. She grabbed a pair of shears and stepped into the square, her voice steady. "You drifters get out, or you'll answer to more than him," she said, pointing at the cowboy. The drifters hesitated, her defiance catching them off guard. The warriors reacted fast, spears rising again. Red Hawk shouted, but the drifters fired, and the cowboy spun, his coat catching another bullet. He didn't fall. His gun flashed, and the lead drifter dropped with a single shot to the chest. The others backed off, melting into the smoke, their courage gone. The sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the square. The fire was fading, thanks to the townsfolk who'd stepped up with buckets and blankets. The warriors stood tall, their spears down now. The townsfolk knelt, some out of respect, some out of fear. The cowboy stood in the center, blood seeping through his coat, but his eyes were steady, unyielding. A woman from the tribe, her hair streaked with gray, stepped forward, a woven blanket in her arms. She draped it over the cowboy's shoulders, her hands steady despite the chaos. "You carry our honor now," she said, her voice soft but firm, like a mother blessing a son. The girl's eyes widened, and even Red Hawk nodded, a gesture that felt like the earth shifting. The blanket was a mark of trust, something no outsider had ever worn. A child, barely 6, broke free from his mother's grip and ran to the cowboy, holding up a small, carved wooden horse. "For you," he said, his voice small but clear, his eyes shining with hero worship. The cowboy took the toy, his rough fingers gentle, and nodded. The boy beamed, running back to his mother, who wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by her son's courage. A town elder, his back bent from years of labor, stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held out a rusted spur, a relic from his own days as a rider. "You've earned this," he said, his voice cracking, "for standing when we didn't." The cowboy took the spur, his fingers brushing the old man's pride, and the elder's eyes shone with a pride he hadn't felt in decades. Red Hawk stepped forward, his hand heavy on the cowboy's shoulder. "My warriors are yours now," he said, his voice low but carrying across the square. The townsfolk murmured, then bowed their heads too. "You saved Dust Valley," one said, and others echoed it. The girl looked at him, her eyes shining through tears. "You did not just save me," she said softly. "You saved everyone." A stray dog, thin and scruffy, trotted into the square, dropping a chewed-up boot at the cowboy's feet. It was one of the drifters, a small, ridiculous relic of the fight. The girl laughed, a sound so clear it cut through the lingering smoke. The cowboy knelt, scratching the dog's ears, and for a moment, the weight of the day seemed to lift, like the sun breaking through after a long storm. He squeezed her hand, just for a moment, his face still streaked with blood and dust. A faint smile crossed his lips, the first anyone had seen. From that day, Dust Valley changed. The cowboy was not just a man anymore. He was the one who brought two worlds together, the one 300 warriors and a whole town bowed to. If you are watching this on television, take a second to grab your phone and hit follow, like, or share. That one click means a lot, and it helps us keep telling stories that matter.